Picture this, January 20th, 1953. A cold winter morning in Washington, D.C. A black limousine pulls up to the north portico of the White House. Inside sits the next President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, hero of World War II, the man who led the Allied forces to victory over Nazi Germany. Waiting inside is the current president, Harry S. Truman, ready with a traditional cup of coffee to greet his successor before they ride together to the Capitol for the inauguration ceremony. It's a time-honored tradition, a gesture of goodwill between the outgoing and incoming president. But something shocking is about to happen. Something that will make history for all the wrong reasons. Eisenhower refuses to leave the car. He won't step foot inside the White House. He won't accept Truman's invitation for coffee. He sits there, arms crossed, waiting for Truman to come outside to him. CBS correspondent Eric Sevareid, who witnessed the moment, would later write, "It was a shocking moment. The White House head usher, J.B. West, said simply, 'I was glad I wasn't in that car.' What could have possibly turned these two American giants, men who had worked together to win World War II and shape the post-war world, into bitter enemies? How did a friendship that once seemed unbreakable descend into such cold hatred that one man couldn't even bring himself to enter the other's house? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most dramatic feuds in presidential history. This is the story of betrayal, political ambition, and wounded pride. This is the story of why Eisenhower refused to enter Truman's White House. To understand how bad things got, you first need to understand how good they once were. Because believe it or not, there was a time when Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower were not just colleagues, they were genuinely fond of each other. Let's rewind to 1945. The war in Europe was ending. Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander, the architect of D-Day, the general who had masterminded the defeat of Nazi Germany. He was, without question, the most celebrated military hero in America. Harry Truman, meanwhile, had just become president after Franklin D. Roosevelt's sudden death in April 1945. He was a former haberdasher from Missouri, a man many viewed as unprepared for the enormous responsibilities now on his shoulders. But Truman recognized greatness when he saw it. And in Dwight Eisenhower, he saw not just a great general, but a man who could shape America's future. On July 15, 1945, something remarkable happened. Truman boarded the USS Augusta at Antwerp, Belgium, on his way to the Potsdam Conference, the meeting where the Allied powers would decide the fate of defeated Germany. Eisenhower was there waiting on the dock. Alone. Just the general and the new president. During that trip, they rode together through Germany. They traveled on the German Autobahn, those impressive four-lane superhighways that had helped move Nazi troops during the war but now served the victorious Allies. Eisenhower was fascinated by these roads, taking mental notes that would later lead to America's interstate highway system. And it was during this car ride that Truman made Eisenhower an offer that seems almost unbelievable today. According to multiple historical accounts, Truman told the general, "There is nothing you may want that I won't try to help you get. That definitely and specifically includes the presidency in 1948. Think about that for a moment. The sitting president of the United States was offering to help his top general become his successor. This wasn't just professional respect, this was genuine admiration. And Truman backed up his words with actions. He awarded Eisenhower the Distinguished Service Medal not once, not twice, but 3 times during his presidency, in 1945, 1948, and 1952. Eisenhower had only received 2 previously in his entire career. After the war, their relationship continued to flourish. Eisenhower left the army to become president of Columbia University, but Truman kept pulling him back into public service. When the Korean War began and NATO was formed, who did Truman call in 1951? Eisenhower. He asked him to serve as the first supreme commander of NATO forces. The two men corresponded regularly. They consulted on matters of national security and foreign policy. Their relationship was strong, built on mutual respect and shared experiences. But here's where things get really interesting. That 1948 offer? Truman wasn't just being polite. In 1947, the contents of Truman's diary would later reveal, he had made an even more extraordinary proposal. Truman wanted Eisenhower to run for president as a Democrat in 1948. Not only that, he offered to step aside and run as Eisenhower's vice president. The sitting president was willing to become second banana to the general he so admired. Eisenhower turned him down. He said he had no interest in politics. He wanted to focus on his work at Columbia, on building a life after the military. Truman accepted this gracefully. He went on to win his own upset victory in 1948, defeating Thomas Dewey in one of the most stunning comebacks in political history. Everything seemed fine. The friendship was intact. Truman was president. Eisenhower was out of politics. But then something changed. The Republican Party came calling. And this time, Eisenhower said yes. By 1951, everything had changed. The Korean War was dragging into its second year with no end in sight. Americans were dying in a conflict that seemed unwinnable. Truman's approval ratings had plummeted to a historic low of 22%, a record that still stands today as the lowest presidential approval rating in Gallup polling history. The Republicans smelled blood in the water. They hadn't won a presidential election since 1928, 24 years of being locked out of the White House. Franklin Roosevelt had won 4 terms, and now Truman had upset Dewey in 1948. The Democrats had controlled the presidency for 2 decades. But 1952 looked different. Truman was deeply unpopular. And the Republicans had a secret weapon, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Here's what must have stung Truman the most. Eisenhower had told him he wasn't interested in politics. He had turned down the Democratic nomination in 1948. But now, just 4 years later, he was accepting the Republican nomination. To Truman, this must have felt like a betrayal. He had offered Eisenhower the presidency on a silver platter. He had been willing to step aside, to serve as Eisenhower's number 2. And Eisenhower had said no to the Democrats, only to turn around and say yes to the Republicans. But Eisenhower had his reasons. The Republican Party was unified behind him. He genuinely believed the Democrats had been in power too long, and that the country needed a change. And perhaps most importantly, he was concerned about isolationist Republicans like Senator Robert Taft, who opposed NATO and the international alliances Eisenhower believed were crucial to American security. But personal feelings aside, politics has a way of turning friends into enemies. And the 1952 campaign was about to get ugly. Really ugly. The Republican strategy was simple and devastating. They called it the 3 C's: corruption, communism, and Korea. They blamed Truman for all 3. The charges of corruption stemmed from various scandals in the Truman administration. The communism angle played into the Red Scare and McCarthyism. And Korea? Well, that was the war nobody wanted, the war that was killing American boys with no victory in sight. Eisenhower didn't make personal attacks himself. That wasn't his style. But he didn't have to. His running mate Richard Nixon and other Republicans did it for him. And then there was Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. McCarthy was at the height of his power in 1952, making wild accusations about communist infiltration of the government. He had accused dozens of officials, intellectuals, and military leaders of being communist sympathizers or outright traitors. And one of his targets was a man who meant everything to both Truman and Eisenhower, General George C. Marshall. George Marshall was one of the most respected figures in American history. He had been Army Chief of Staff during World War II. He had been Truman's Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. He had created the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after the war, work that would eventually earn him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. And he was Eisenhower's mentor. More than anyone else, Marshall was responsible for Eisenhower's rapid rise during World War II. Marshall had recommended Eisenhower for promotion over hundreds of more senior officers. He had advocated for Eisenhower to lead D-Day. Marshall had made Eisenhower's career. But McCarthy called Marshall a traitor. He accused him of being part of a communist conspiracy. Senator William Jenner of Indiana called Marshall a front man for traitors. Everyone expected Eisenhower to defend Marshall. After all, this was his mentor, the man he owed everything to. Eisenhower was scheduled to campaign in Wisconsin, McCarthy's home state, in October 1952. His speechwriters prepared remarks that included a defense of Marshall. The paragraph read, "I know that charges of disloyalty have been leveled against General Marshall. I have been privileged for 35 years to know General Marshall personally. I know him, as a man and as a soldier, to be dedicated with singular selflessness and the profoundest patriotism to the service of America." The press had been tipped off about this passage. Reporters were waiting to see Eisenhower stand up to McCarthy. This was going to be the moment that defined the campaign. But then, under pressure from Wisconsin Governor Walter Kohler Jr. and Republican leaders who feared losing the state, Eisenhower made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He deleted the defense of Marshall from his speech. He gave the address without mentioning Marshall at all. And then, to make matters worse, he stood on stage next to McCarthy and allowed himself to be photographed shaking the senator's hand, as if he endorsed everything McCarthy stood for. The New York Times ran the story on its front page. The missing Marshall defense became a national scandal. And Harry Truman? He was absolutely furious. Truman had initially planned to stay out of the campaign. After all, his approval ratings were terrible, and the Democratic nominee, Adlai Stevenson, was an intellectual from Illinois who many thought could win on his own merits. But after Eisenhower's failure to defend Marshall, Truman couldn't stay silent. This was personal now. This was about honor, loyalty, and what Truman saw as moral cowardice. Truman launched a whistle-stop campaign, traveling the country by train just as he had in 1948. But this time, his message was different. This time, it was personal. He called Eisenhower a coward. He accused him of moral blindness. He said the general had lost his nerve and was afraid of Mac the Knife, his nickname for McCarthy. At a campaign stop in Ohio, Truman told the crowd, "There was a time when I thought he would make a good president. That was my mistake." In other speeches, he called Eisenhower a stooge for Wall Street and a puppet of Republican reactionaries. But the attacks that cut deepest were about Marshall. Truman reminded audiences that Marshall had made Eisenhower's career. That Marshall had chosen Eisenhower over hundreds of more qualified generals. That Marshall had trusted Eisenhower. And now Eisenhower wouldn't even defend him. Truman also shared a story, though its accuracy has been debated by historians, about how Marshall had allegedly saved Eisenhower's career during the war. According to Truman, Eisenhower had become romantically involved with his driver, Kay Summersby, and had written to Marshall saying he wanted to divorce his wife Mamie and marry Summersby. Marshall supposedly wrote back in very strong terms, threatening to destroy Eisenhower's career if he went through with it. Whether this story was true or not, Truman's point was clear: Marshall had not only made Eisenhower's career, he had saved it. And this was how Eisenhower repaid him. For Eisenhower, who was not accustomed to personal attacks in politics, Truman's assault was devastating. One of Eisenhower's speechwriters, Emmett John Hughes, later wrote that during the campaign, the mere mention of Harry Truman's name brought fast flashes of antipathy in the general. Eisenhower took it all personally. To him, Truman wasn't just campaigning against his policies, he was attacking Eisenhower's character, his honor, his integrity. But despite Truman's attacks, or perhaps because of how unpopular Truman himself was, Eisenhower won in a landslide. On November 4, 1952, he captured 442 electoral votes to Stevenson's 89, winning 55% of the popular vote. He even broke through the Solid South, traditionally Democratic territory, winning Virginia, Florida, Tennessee, and Texas. The Republicans had done it. After 20 years in the wilderness, they had retaken the White House. But the victory came with a price. The friendship between Eisenhower and Truman was dead. And it was about to get buried. Presidential transitions are supposed to be about continuity, about ensuring the smooth transfer of power that makes American democracy function. But the transition from Truman to Eisenhower in late 1952 and early 1953 was anything but smooth. Eisenhower and Truman met only once between the election and inauguration day. It was on November 18, 1952, at the White House. Truman wanted to brief Eisenhower on world affairs, White House staffing, and the challenges ahead. Eisenhower later wrote that the meeting added little to my knowledge, nor did it affect my planning for the new administration. In other words, he thought it was a waste of time. Truman, for his part, felt like Eisenhower wasn't listening. He later wrote that everything he said to Eisenhower went into one ear and out the other. He predicted that Eisenhower would struggle as president, saying, "He'll sit right here and he'll say do this, do that. And nothing will happen. Poor Ike, it won't be a bit like the army. He'll find it very frustrating." Clark Clifford, Truman's special counsel, would later describe the atmosphere between the two men during this period. The hatred, he said, was like a monsoon. Eisenhower even turned down Truman's invitation for a second meeting, rejecting any further contact until absolutely necessary. The only pleasant moment came on December 1st, when Bess Truman gave Mamie Eisenhower a tour of the White House. The First Ladies maintained their composure and courtesy, even as their husbands could barely stand to be in the same room. As January 20th approached, the tension only grew worse. There were petty disagreements about protocol. Eisenhower decided to wear a Homburg hat instead of the traditional silk top hat for the inauguration. He didn't consult Truman about this break with tradition. Truman went along with it rather than create a scene, but the incident added to the growing chill. Eisenhower seemed to be going out of his way to irritate the outgoing president. He made campaign promises and policy statements without coordinating with Truman. He assembled his cabinet and made announcements without traditional courtesies. Privately, Eisenhower told associates he was dreading the inauguration ceremony. He wondered aloud whether he could stand sitting next to that guy during the car ride to the Capitol. And then there was the coffee incident. January 20th, 1953, dawned cold and clear in Washington, D.C. Inauguration Day. The day when power would transfer from Harry S. Truman, the 33rd president, to Dwight D. Eisenhower, the 34th. Inside the White House, preparations had been made. Coffee was ready. The Trumans were dressed and waiting to greet the Eisenhowers for the traditional pre-inauguration gathering. It's a simple gesture of hospitality. Incoming and outgoing presidents share a cup of coffee, exchange some pleasantries, and then ride together to the Capitol. At the appointed time, a black limousine pulled up to the north portico. Inside were Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower. The new president and first lady had arrived. The door to the White House opened. Staff waited to usher them inside. Harry and Bess Truman stood ready to greet them. And then, nothing. The Eisenhowers didn't move. They didn't get out of the car. They didn't come inside. Eisenhower had made a decision. He would not set foot in the White House until he could enter as president. He wouldn't accept Truman's hospitality. He wouldn't share that traditional cup of coffee. Instead, he sat in the car, arms crossed, and waited for Truman to come outside to him. Inside the White House, there was confusion. Then understanding. Then shock. This wasn't just a break with tradition. This was a deliberate insult. A calculated snub. Eisenhower was making it clear, in the most public way possible, that he wanted nothing to do with Harry Truman. What must Truman have felt in that moment? Hurt? Anger? Humiliation? Here was a man he had admired, a man he had promoted, a man he had offered the presidency to, and that man wouldn't even enter his house. But Truman was nothing if not proud. He wasn't going to make a scene. He put on his coat and hat and walked outside. The photographers were waiting. They captured the moment when Truman climbed into the car next to Eisenhower. Both men smiled for the cameras, but their eyes told a different story. CBS correspondent Eric Severide, watching from the press pool, immediately grasped the significance. He would later write, "It was a shocking moment. J.B. West, the White House chief usher who had overseen countless presidential transitions, summed it up perfectly. "I was glad I wasn't in that car." And so began one of the most awkward car rides in presidential history. Two American giants, two men who had helped shape the world, sitting shoulder to shoulder in stony silence as they made their way to the Capitol. Well, not complete silence. According to both men's later memoirs, there was at least one exchange during that frigid ride. The conversation they had would reveal just how deep the animosity ran, but also hint at something more complex beneath the surface. Eisenhower turned to Truman and asked a question. Who had ordered his son John back from Korea for the inauguration? This might seem like an odd thing to bring up. But it wasn't. John Eisenhower was serving as an officer in Korea, in the middle of an active war zone. Bringing him home for the inauguration required presidential authority. Eisenhower hadn't arranged it. So someone else had. And he wanted to know who. Truman's response, as he later recalled it, was simple. "I did. The president thought it was right and proper for your son to witness the swearing-in of his father to the presidency." Think about that for a moment. Here's Harry Truman, a man who has just been publicly humiliated by Eisenhower. A man who Eisenhower wouldn't even share a cup of coffee with. And yet, behind the scenes, Truman had done something remarkably thoughtful and generous. He had made sure Eisenhower's son could witness his father's greatest moment. This was the complexity of their relationship. Beneath the bitterness and anger, there were still traces of the respect they once had for each other. Truman could despise Eisenhower's actions during the campaign, could feel betrayed by his political decisions, and yet still believe that a father should have his son present at his inauguration. The car arrived at the Capitol. The two men got out, still maintaining the fiction of civility for the cameras. They proceeded to the platform where Chief Justice Fred Vinson would administer the oath of office. Eisenhower delivered his inaugural address, speaking of America's responsibility as the leader of the free world, of the need for strength and unity in the face of communist threats. The inaugural parade that followed was spectacular, 10 miles long, with marching bands, floats depicting scenes from Eisenhower's life, and even a live turtle waving an American flag with its front legs. At one point, a television cowboy named Monty Montana lassoed President Eisenhower with the permission of the Secret Service, creating one of the more unusual moments in inaugural history. But while Eisenhower celebrated his victory, Harry Truman quietly slipped away. He headed to Union Station, where a crowd of at least 5,000 people had gathered to see him off. According to his daughter Margaret, it was an emotional scene. At least 5,000 people were in the concourse, shouting and cheering. It was like the 1944 and 1948 conventions. The police had to form a flying wedge to get us to the train. Inside, the party started all over again. Newspaper men and women who had spent 8 years tearing Dad apart came in to mumble apologies and swear they never meant a word of it. Truman boarded the train and headed home to Independence, Missouri. He was no longer president. And he wouldn't return to the White House for 8 long years. For the next 8 years, from January 1953 until January 1961, Eisenhower served as president. During that entire time, he and Truman barely spoke. The most popular World War II general and the man who had been president during the war's conclusion had become strangers. Eisenhower never invited Truman to the White House. Not once. Not for ceremonial occasions, not for consultations on policy, not for anything. The silence was deliberate and complete. Truman spent those years in Independence, working on his memoirs, building his presidential library, and occasionally commenting on current events. According to his biographer David McCullough, Truman could hardly refer to Eisenhower without using profanity. The bitterness had settled deep into his bones. For more than 5 years, from January 1953 until May 1958, Eisenhower extended no invitations to Truman whatsoever. The former working relationship, the regular correspondence they had maintained during Truman's presidency, all of it had disappeared. The world moved on. The Korean War ended in July 1953 with an armistice. The Cold War intensified. The interstate highway system, inspired by those German autobahns Eisenhower and Truman had driven on together in 1945, began construction. The civil rights movement gained momentum. And through it all, two of America's most important 20th century leaders remained estranged. Truman made at least one attempt to bridge the gap. When Eisenhower visited Missouri during his presidency, Truman tried to arrange a meeting. But he was told the president's schedule was much too full. The message was clear: Eisenhower didn't want to see him. Then came the election of 1960. John F. Kennedy, the young Democratic senator from Massachusetts, narrowly defeated Vice President Richard Nixon. The Democrats were returning to the White House after 8 years in exile. But before Kennedy's inauguration, something unexpected happened. Something that suggested the wounds between Truman and Eisenhower might finally begin to heal. It was October 1959. General George C. Marshall, the man at the center of so much of the bitterness between Truman and Eisenhower, had died. He was 78 years old, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, one of the most respected figures of his generation. His funeral was held in Virginia. And there, in the first pew, sat two men who hadn't been in the same room since Inauguration Day 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower and former President Harry S. Truman. They sat side by side. They didn't speak much, but they were there together, united in grief for a man they had both admired, even if they had disagreed about how to honor his memory during the 1952 campaign. Marshall's death created a tiny opening, a crack in the wall of ice between them. Fast forward to January 21, 1961, the day after John F. Kennedy's inauguration. Kennedy, aware of the rift between the two men, decided to do something about it. He invited Truman to visit the White House. It was the first time Truman had set foot in the building since he left 8 years earlier. The invitation was significant, symbolic. Kennedy was honoring a Democratic predecessor, but he was also trying to heal an old wound. Truman accepted. He toured the White House that he had lived in for nearly 8 years. It must have been emotional, bittersweet, returning to a place full of memories, remembering a time when he had wielded the power of the presidency. But the real reconciliation came in November 1963, under the most tragic circumstances imaginable. President Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963. The nation was in shock. The world mourned. And among those who came to Washington for the funeral were two former presidents, Dwight D. Eisenhower and Harry S. Truman. They found themselves together again, this time at Arlington National Cemetery for the graveside service. Once more, they were seated next to each other. Once more, shared grief brought them into proximity. But this time, something was different. After the service, they shared a car ride, their first since that frozen morning in January 1953. This time, the ride took them to Blair House, where Truman was staying. And this is where the story comes full circle in the most beautiful way. When they arrived at Blair House, Truman invited Eisenhower inside. For coffee. 10 years after Eisenhower had refused Truman's invitation for coffee at the White House, after a decade of silence and bitterness, after all the hurt and anger and wounded pride, Eisenhower said yes. They sat together. They drank coffee. They ate sandwiches. They talked. We don't know everything they discussed that day. But we know it was pleasant. We know they were civil, perhaps even warm. The hatred that had been like a monsoon on Inauguration Day 1953 had finally burned itself out. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. They didn't become close friends again. The wounds were too deep, the memories too painful. But they had at least made peace with each other. They would see each other occasionally after that, at public events, at funerals, at moments when former presidents were expected to gather. They were cordial. The war was over. Harry Truman died on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88. Dwight Eisenhower had died 3 years earlier, on March 28, 1969, at the age of 78. Both men lived long enough to see their legacies secure. Truman is now remembered for the Marshall Plan, for integration of the military, for standing up to Soviet expansion. Eisenhower is remembered for the interstate highway system, for ending the Korean War, for steady leadership during the Cold War. And their feud? It's remembered as a cautionary tale about how politics can poison even the strongest friendships. About how personal slights and wounded pride can overshadow shared accomplishments. About how difficult it is to maintain grace and dignity in the heat of political combat. So why did Eisenhower refuse to enter Truman's White House on that cold January morning in 1953? The simple answer is anger. He was furious about Truman's personal attacks during the campaign. He felt insulted, belittled, treated unfairly by a man who should have been supporting the democratic process rather than attacking the character of his successor. But the deeper answer is more complicated. It was about betrayal on both sides. Truman felt betrayed that Eisenhower had turned down the Democratic nomination only to accept the Republican one. He felt betrayed that Eisenhower wouldn't defend George Marshall. Eisenhower felt betrayed by Truman's vicious personal attacks that questioned not just his policies but his courage, his integrity, his honor. And in the end, what started on a German Autobahn in 1945 with Truman offering Eisenhower anything he wanted, including the presidency, ended with a cup of coffee at Blair House in 1963. Full circle. From friendship to enmity to, finally, a kind of peace. Their story reminds us that even our greatest leaders are human. They have pride. They hold grudges. They can be petty and small even as they accomplish great things. But their story also reminds us that reconciliation is possible. That time can heal even the deepest wounds. That shared grief and the perspective of age can soften the hardest hearts. If you enjoyed this deep dive into presidential history, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more stories like this one, tales of ambition, betrayal, and redemption from America's past. Drop a comment below. Do you think Eisenhower was justified in refusing to enter the White House? Or should he have risen above the political attacks and maintained tradition? What would you have done? And if you want to learn more about these two remarkable men, check out the links in the description. There are some excellent books and documentaries that explore their lives and their complex relationship in even greater detail. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep exploring history, because the stories of our past have a lot to teach us about our present.